Hello everyone, welcome to our next lecture for electronic music techniques. As you can see, the topic of the day is an introduction to MIDI. So we will be talking about what MIDI is, we'll talk about its history and usage, talk a little bit about MIDI files, as well as MIDI data and MIDI messages so we can make sure we know what exactly it is that's going on and how we can make it work for us artistically. So what is MIDI? A great question to start with. It stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. And when we talk about MIDI, the words that I really want to stick with you are data protocol. So as you can see here, I have written, it's a standardized data protocol for musical devices and pieces of software. So MIDI, at the end of the day, is a data protocol. It is a means of storing digital information and having it communicate from one device to the other. That's all MIDI really is. In terms of how it intersects with music and software and instruments, obviously that's really important to us and we will talk about that, but just remember that MIDI by itself is nothing more than a type of data that we can store and keep track of. So this MIDI data protocol determines a few things, including the language or the coded bits for describing events and global information, including the cables that send the data, the ports that these cables actually plug into, as well as the computer files to store MIDI data. So when I say this protocol determines these things, these really are the foundations of that MIDI data protocol. It is a particular language that describes both events and global information, and we will distinguish those two in a minute. And then these like MIDI cables and ports, which are still in use today, although not as frequent as they were, but you do still see them on modern devices. That's part of this MIDI protocol. And then these computer files, you can have what we would call MIDI files. So just like you can have like a Word document that ends in like .word, you can also have files that end in .midi. You can have actual files that are of the MIDI type. So why MIDI? Okay. So in the mid to late 20th century, a bunch of companies were developing keyboards, synthesizers, instruments, and other types of controllers. It became accessible technology, became affordable, and it became commercially successful. And lots of people were making all these sort of different devices with different standards for how they communicate, both with themselves and each other. The idea that these devices could talk to each other became an alluring one. So if you have a MIDI keyboard and I have a sequencer and you have a drum pad and I have a controller and they're all feeding into one computer, if they were all on the same data protocol, they could stay in time, they could stay in sync, they could receive note information and they could play together and they could sound well together, and we would really expand our options for musical performance on stage or recording in the studio or, creating music on your own in your own home space. So hence the MIDI protocol was born. And while MIDI 2.0 was recently announced like less than a year ago, the common info and controls related to MIDI mostly remain unchanged. So what I'm talking about today is sort of, really the foundations of like MIDI 1.0 and other versions, along those lines. But everything I'm saying is still true with MIDI 2.0. So if you learn anything about MIDI 2.0, just know that this is all still relevant. But now that the sort of group that controls MIDI has announced this new protocol many years after the original was announced, there may be some changes to how software and certain devices handle MIDI in the future, but none of this should really change or go out of date. So MIDI usage. Historically, it will allow keyboards and other MIDI-enabled devices to communicate. That's really the big part of it in terms of why it exists in the first place. Coordinating musical time in the studio and in live performance. Because again, if multiple MIDI-enabled devices are connected and talking to each other, they can stay in time and they can, put on a better musical performance than we would if you had different data protocols across multiple devices and computers and systems. Lighting, believe it or not, a lot of light boards that you would use for like a theater or an auditorium where you can like fade lights, up and down across, different lights in that space. Those are often also using the MIDI data protocol because it doesn't have to be musical. It's just the most common usage of it, but you can still just send control data. So quite often when you are using a light board and you're fading lights up and down, you're still using that MIDI data protocol actually. Currently, and keep in mind, all those historical things are still true. To this day, lighting is not quite as common to use MIDI, but it still certainly does happen. But currently, what we could say is a little bit more true is that we are going to trigger samples to play. That's one of the biggest uses of MIDI, which we will talk about in this course in the future and in other courses in the MAP program. And a real big part, which is really the topic of today and of the very near future, is to trigger synthesizers to play. So we are going to use this MIDI data to tell our synthesizer what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. And we can also coordinate musical time in software. So we can use MIDI files and MIDI data to control like the tempo and the key and other sort of musical elements, more global parameters like that. So MIDI communication, when we are talking about external communication, we are talking about using MIDI cables or USB cables. MIDI cables, which we'll show you an example of in a minute, are not nearly as common as they used to be because we can send the MIDI data via a USB cable, which stands for Universal Serial Bus. And there are different sort of types and shapes of USB cables. There's USB 2.0, there's USB 3.0, there's USB 3.1 Gen 1, USB 3.1 Gen 2, there's Thunderbolt 3, which is the same shape as USB-C, which can be USB 2 or could be USB 3.1 Gen 2, but not Thunderbolt 3. There's like a lot of data types and ports right now, but any and all of those can send MIDI because MIDI is a really small amount of data compared to other forms of communication that those cables are used to handling. And then also when it comes to external use of MIDI, we're talking about MIDI keyboards, devices, instruments, drum pads, etc. That's an example of how we use MIDI in the sort of external world. Also with audio or MIDI interfaces. MIDI interfaces are not as common as they used to be because, again, our computers and USB cables can handle that. But some audio interfaces, including mine in this space, it actually has MIDI cables on the back of it in case you want to connect your MIDI device to your audio interface and then use your audio interface to connect to your computer. You can kind of save some cables and make it a little neater, but it's not particularly necessary to have an audio interface with MIDI cables, but it can be nice. Internal, which is a little bit more of what we are going to focus on, really almost entirely what we'll focus on in this course. We're talking about MIDI tracks or instrument tracks, as we would call them in Studio One and Logic. So I have an example on the right, and we'll look at the software in a minute, but this example on the right is showing a MIDI track, or as we call them in Studio One, we call them instrument tracks. That's also what we call them in Logic, where they hold a software instrument like the MIDI synthesizer or the Sample One sampler, and then we store MIDI data on that track that triggers the synthesizer or the sampler. So the MIDI is just the data that then tells MIDI or Sample One what to do and when to do it. If you work on some digital audio workstations like Digital Performer, which actually used to just be called Performer, which was one of the earliest examples of MIDI sequencing on the software side of things, they'll have like a MIDI track, and all that track does is store MIDI data. It doesn't have an instrument on it. And then you route that MIDI data to a software instrument track. You get the same result at the end of the day, but you get a little bit more flexible routing in some of those pieces of software. And some people really prefer that. I don't mind it. I'm fine with just one track with an instrument and MIDI data, and it works well for me. And we'll talk about how you can get some interesting routing with MIDI and audio and instruments in Studio One as well. So most of those options that you can achieve in something like Digital Performer, you can still accomplish in Studio One. MIDI files. MIDI files are standalone file types that contain only MIDI information. In other words, they don't contain audio, so they are very small. And it's really important that you know that a MIDI file itself is not an audio file. You can't listen to a MIDI file. A computer has to interpret that MIDI data and then use that to trigger sounds or samples or synths or whatever it might be. But MIDI itself is just a collection of data that stores like when to hit a note, how long to hit a note, etc. So MIDI was used to create like video game sequences, in the late 80s and early 90s, because you could have really small file sizes for the sort of notation of the score, and then you just had like a little built-in synthesizer with the video game, and you just triggered those things along the way. So MIDI files by themselves are really small, and they do not contain audio. So remember that they do not contain audio. What they do contain is global information. Like the tempo, the key, that sort of stuff. They contain the MIDI time code, as mentioned, tempo, time signature, key of the work, channel-specific information, notes and rhythms for each MIDI track, and other information such as pitch bend for each MIDI track. So we'll return to some of these terms in a second, but that's typically what's contained in a MIDI file, and that's it. There isn't audio. That's the real big thing I want to stress right now. MIDI channels. We always have to have a discussion about MIDI channels, even though this information in the modern sense is kind of outdated. You'd be surprised how often modern pieces of software still adhere to this. So a MIDI channel is a unique stream of MIDI data intended to control a single sound source. The channel links the data to the receiver. So in other words, right, this channel contains info like pitch, like what pitch am I playing? That's what it's going to contain. Or how fast did I strike the key? Like if I strike the key on my MIDI keyboard really fast with a high velocity, it's going to play a louder note. So we have to keep track of what note I'm playing. How fast do I strike it? How long do I hold the key down? Am I using the pitch bend wheel on my keyboard? Other controls? That's what's being sort of sent through this MIDI channel, that sort of information. And this is one of the really important parts, is that MIDI channels are grouped into sets of 16. And I mention that because, and this is an example of like 16 MIDI channels. I mention that because modern pieces of software could do more than 16 channels like in a group for MIDI, but because that was the standard of the old cable, like the MIDI cable showing here, that's sort of what we stick to with a lot of pieces of software, because maybe we are still using that software to connect to a proper MIDI device that only has MIDI cables. And since we're using that MIDI standard, we can't really exceed the 16 channels. Otherwise, devices might not be able to communicate with each other. So that's why we still typically have 16 channels at a time. And you'll see that that is the case in some elements of Studio One, or even like Contact by Native Instruments, which is a really popular sampler that can be triggered via MIDI. It can only do 16 channels like at a time, and you have to kind of create multiple instances of Contact to go beyond, or you have to be a little creative with your routing. MIDI devices themselves, like a MIDI keyboard, like a proper MIDI keyboard, will have MIDI in, out, and sometimes MIDI through if you're connecting multiple devices with each other. Again, it's going to become increasingly rare that any of you will come across devices with MIDI ports where you need to connect one MIDI cable to another, because USB is just becoming more common. But be aware that, you know, this MIDI cable on the right, that's what you're going to use to connect. And you're going to, one thing to remember, you don't connect the in to the in, just to let you know. Like if you have two devices, you go from the output of one to the input of another, which makes sense when you think about it, but there's something about wanting to plug the in to the in and the out to the out. That's not the case. In goes to out and out goes to in. So if you do ever have to plug these in, just remember that might be a trap you fall into, and if you're not getting data sent between devices, try flipping those. Might solve your problem. Now, these days, as mentioned, we use USB to connect most MIDI devices, but again, the concept of 16 channels remains common. So MIDI and synthesizers. And again, a reminder, MIDI makes no sound. I know I'm saying that a lot, but I really want you to just take it home that MIDI doesn't make any sounds, okay? Instead, many MIDI keyboards are simply controllers. They send data to other devices that make sound. So that's what we're going to be dealing with in this case. We are going to have like the MIDI synthesizer. We're going to have sample one. We're going to have the impact drum pad controller. All of that stuff, those are the devices that will make sound. And we will send MIDI data from those tracks on Studio One, like I'm showing over here on the right. We will send that data to the instrument, and then the instrument will know how to interpret that data and make the appropriate sounds. So MIDI data that can be sent to something like a synthesizer, and then that triggers that sound, which is exactly what I'm saying. MIDI data can also be sent to a sampler, which will cause the sampler to play audio samples. And again, that's something that we will demonstrate in this class, both with like synthesizers and samplers. We will look at that before the end. So when we are actually, via these MIDI channels, okay, so that's the information is flowing via that MIDI channel, but the information itself going across that channel can be described as MIDI messages. And MIDI messages are what are sent, again, from the device to the things that make that sound via those MIDI channels. So I have like a MIDI keyboard and I press a key. The information on that key goes through a MIDI channel and it sends a MIDI message, and it just sends one at a time. We could send a lot at once. We could send 1,000 at once, right? We could send tons of information at once, lots of messages, but we're still sending discrete messages one at a time. And that message gets sent to the thing that makes the sound. They are the heart of the MIDI protocol. That's really, and so some of the data that is included in these MIDI messages is one of the things that we really want to know about. So MIDI messages, we have what we call the channel voice. These are channel voice messages, meaning they are going to be messages that only apply to the information on one channel, not all channels. There are some examples that you need to know that will be on some assessments. Note on, okay? So again, just to break this, here we have my keyboard, I play a note, and we are sending what we would call a channel voice message in this context. It only applies to that one channel, whatever I'm doing at that moment. Note on is one of the best example of the type of message, the type of information in a message that you want to know first. it gives us a note number. So for example, middle C is 60 in MIDI, which is something you just probably want to have memorized, but you'll see these numbers in Studio One and other pieces of software. And it also provides a velocity. So when I send my note on message through that MIDI channel to the device, I'm telling that software, I'm telling that sampler that I played middle C and I hit it really fast. So play that thing really loud. Velocity is what we say. Because really when you play a keyboard, it's not about how hard you press the key, it's about how fast you press the key. And if you think I'm making that up, well, first of all, force is mass times acceleration, so you're a fool. But secondly, try to play a keyboard key really hard, but really slowly. It's difficult. Try that. But velocity is really going to, in the world of MIDI, velocity will be loudness of sort of how we strike the key. And then again, the note number, which note did we play? We will also have note off. Okay, so also the note number of which note I was playing and when did my finger come off the key, and that's going to send a velocity of 0. So we could go all the way to a velocity of like 127, which we'll talk about in a second if I really press the key fast and hard. And then when I let go, we send a velocity of 0 saying, well, that key is no longer being pressed because there is no velocity to it. And then we will also have program change. This is not so relevant now unless you're working with external devices, but the idea is that it would change the intended synthesized sound or sampled sound that the MIDI information will trigger. Again, more common if you have like an outboard synth or something that is intending to sort of speak with more proper classical old school MIDI. In the world of the digital audio workstation and synthesizers we are working with, not going to be as relevant. And then also pitch bend. If you've worked with a MIDI keyboard that has a pitch bend wheel that can kind of like make the pitch go up and down, that's also going to be on this channel voice message. Then we also have what we call system common messages. These messages apply to all 16 of those channels from device A to device A to device B, or from the MIDI device to the synth or sampler. Again, some examples you need to know include MIDI timecode. These will be messages that let multiple devices stay in sync. There's lots of different types of time codes across different devices. Video cameras have time codes, audio recorders have time codes, and MIDI will have a time code. Also, the key, so whatever key the piece is in, can be transmitted via this system common message, as well as the time signature and the tempo. MIDI messages that we would call control change, these are a form of channel voice messages. So remember, we were just talking about, and I'll go back for a second just to show you, we were talking about system common messages. Those go to all channels, all 16. And we were also talking about the channel voice. So channel voice messages go on just one channel. System common messages go on all channels. And then we can say that control change is a type of channel voice message. So we're still in that channel voice message category. They can perform a wide variety of tasks. And what's great is that some are predefined, and there are good lists online that can easily tell you what some of these standards are. But what's really great about these control change messages is that they're often determined by the manufacturer. So a company like Native Instruments might pick particular control change messages with particular values assigned to them. This gets a little abstract to talk about. It becomes a lot clearer when we look at it in context, which is something that we will do to a limited extent in this course, but in other courses like effects processing and synthesis and audio for video, where we also talk about MIDI, it will become a little bit clearer. So if nothing else, tuck this information away for a future day. Again, right, so it'll become more apparent in context, especially things like Native Instruments. They're a company that that's a big part of how they sort of develop their software. These control change messages are really important with how you sequence MIDI. A few MIDI details. MIDI has a range of 0 to 127, which I sort of hinted at before, or we could say 128 discrete values. Each MIDI note or controller value has 7 bits dedicated to determining the value, and you can imagine 2 to the 7th power is 128, which is why we are within that value range. As such, there are 128 MIDI notes, control change numbers, velocities, etc. A good way to think about that means that when I play a note on my MIDI keyboard, the quietest I could play it would be 1 because 0 is off, and the loudest I could play it would be 127. So you kind of have like a range of 1 all the way up to 127 or 0 if you're counting not doing anything at all. Those are the sort of shades of information you have. So the actual bit depth of MIDI is relatively small, but the bit depth of things that it might be talking to can be significantly higher. Because again, remember, MIDI is just that data protocol. So with that in mind, we're now going to look at some MIDI controls in Studio One to put some of this in context, but we'll return to some of these ideas in the future and continue to elaborate on them and really try to establish more information about MIDI, because it's really great to have a solid MIDI foundation when you're doing any kind of electronic music production, because almost all of it still communicates with MIDI. All right, so once again, we are in Studio One, and all I have done, very similar to where we left off in our previous video, I just have a single instance of the MIDI synthesizer, and I've just picked a preset. In this case, I've chosen one from the Bell category called Bell Xylo Bell, and I thought it just sounded nice and kind of straightforward for what we want to talk about, so this is what it sounds like. So a simple and pleasant enough sound. And right now, we're not going to focus on any of the elements of the MIDI synthesizer itself. More on that in the future compared to what we have already discussed. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. And let's actually record and generate some MIDI data, because that really helps us out. And I think the easiest way to do that is to simply hit record and just play some notes, either on your physical keyboard or on the QWERTY keyboard if you set that up, whatever is easiest for you. One thing I'll show you just that helps me out a lot is the metronome down here. So you'll notice that we have this pre-count option, we have what's called the metronome setup, and then we have whether the metronome is on or off. So if I turn the metronome off, we're not going to hear it, and that won't matter. I'm going to turn it on because I like to record along to a metronome click so that I stay in time. But let's open up the metronome settings window real quickly and just take a look, because for example, I like to turn on this pre-count option, which again, I could trigger right here as well. This pre-count option gives me one full measure of click before it starts recording, so I can kind of get the tempo in my head, and you'll see that in a second. But I want to show you this because we can also, change the accent. We can change whether there's a beat and how much weight and volume it gets. So we can turn that up. We can turn up the offbeat. We can change the sound of our metronome. So I'm pretty okay with the default settings for this, but you might want to kind of experiment and see if there's a particular metronome click that works well for you. I usually keep this click in play button unchecked, so I only hear the metronome when I'm recording, and then when I hit play, I don't hear that annoying click the whole time. You can also render the metronome to a track if you ever need to make a click track for someone to perform along to, or you need to bounce out a metronome that maybe goes through some changes that help a performer do something. So know that that option is available. I'm just going to leave this to pre-count. I'm going to go ahead and leave my tempo at 90 in 4/4 time, and I'm just going to hit record and just play some chords here. Okay, so just like that, I now have MIDI data. And as you can see, we actually see little, horizontal lines that represent each of the notes that I physically played on the keyboard. We can play it back and it's going to sound pretty darn close to what I just recorded. Cool, so that is one of the quickest ways to generate MIDI. Real quick, and just a feature if you did not know, you can right-click on any track and select duplicate that track, which in this case will create another instance of that MIDI synthesizer on an instrument track. I could undo, and I can also duplicate the track complete. This will copy the actual MIDI data as well. In this case, I don't want to do that. I just want to duplicate this track to show you one other option. Let's say I don't want to begin by, hitting record and playing. Maybe I don't know what I want to play yet, but there's nowhere to record MIDI data. You'll notice we've created a nice little MIDI region up here. One other way you can go about this is you can select your paint tool, or again, you could hit 5 on your keyboard, and then you can just draw, and you can draw a region however long you'd like it to be. I can hit 1 on my keyboard to go back to my little, handy arrow tool, or in this case, technically my multi-tool. And then I could move this region around, and then I could manually enter notes into this region if I wanted to. So sometimes it's nice to just create that region first. Other times it's nice to just start playing. Because for example, if I click on this, you'll notice it opens up my editor. And in the past, the editor has primarily been for audio files, because if I double click an audio file, it opens up my audio editor. But if it's a MIDI region, it knows to populate the edit tab with my MIDI controls. And you can see if I select the region where I recorded some information, we can actually see the notes that I recorded, from my MIDI keyboard. We can click them and hear them back to audition them if we want to. We can actually change the length of them. We can even move them up and down. This is great. Let's say I messed up. Let's say I played one note wrong. Well, I can just move that note. Or I could select multiple notes and I could move them. Well, I didn't mean to select all of those. Select those and move them up. I'm not saying this is going to sound good, but you know, it'll be different. Okay, I actually like the chord that I moved those to, but I didn't like moving that note. Yeah, let's move this instead. Instead of going from like an A minor chord to a C major chord, let's go from A minor, and we could drag this up to starting on F. Now we'll have, I think actually that's kind of what I wanted to play. And then I want to go to C, and then, oh no, to C, and then I want to go to G. Notice how easy it is to just transpose and move things around. Cool. So this is MIDI data. These are MIDI notes. These are kind of like MIDI messages. We can see what the note is. We can see how long we were playing it. And also we can move this cool little window up and we can actually see the velocity. We will talk about modulation, pitch bend, and aftertouch, but velocity is by far the most important of these. We can actually see how hard and fast I struck each of these notes along the way. We can also select these and we can change them. We can move them up or down and make these all quieter or make them all louder. So we can just bring the velocity up all the way, and we're just going to hear them all at their sort of full volume. Now, in this case, it doesn't necessarily get a whole lot louder, but it gets a little bit more plain because it loses that human element of not every note being the same volume, because no person plays every single note the exact same volume. And having these sort of curves to all these velocities is actually really, really useful. Additionally, I could also, much like I did to create the MIDI region, I could grab my paint tool and I can just draw notes. And you'll notice that when I draw them, it does it at a fixed velocity. I can go back to my selection tool and I can change the velocity of any of these notes. I can also select a note here to have it highlight and then change its velocity. But you don't always have to play things in. You can just draw them. And if I click on a note, I erase it, so I'm sometimes getting rid of notes, but I can also just click, and you can change your default value of what note you're going to add. Right now it's adding an 8th note, but I could just click and drag and make that note longer to fill any particular amount of time that I want. Yeah, this is the toe tapper. And actually I lied, sorry, it's making a 16th note, not an 8th note. I was looking at the grid wrong. You can actually see here, I have my little grid of beat 1 of measure 1, beat 2 of measure 1, beat 3 of measure 1, beat 4 of measure 1, and then here's, you know, measure 2 and so forth. So we can kind of see where these beats are, and we can see all my little 16th notes within. I can do things like hit Control or Command A, and I can just delete and get rid of those, and I can instead going to be the artistic masterpiece of the 21st century. Okay, so this is all we're going to discuss for the time being, but even with what I've shown you with what you can do in terms of sound design with the MIDI synthesizer, and then your ability to record these MIDI notes and do basic alterations, drawing of notes, changing their timing and velocity, you actually already have some tremendously powerful musical capability for creating really interesting and wonderful sounding stuff. And I don't want you to take that for granted and think that you need a whole ton more to start making really great music. I would highly recommend you open up Studio One, make an instance or two of the MIDI synth, and just start recording some MIDI data, editing it around, moving it, copying and pasting it, and just seeing what kind of cool stuff you can start to generate already. So with that in mind, we will dive more into both synthesis and MIDI in the very near future, but please don't wait, start making some music now.